in Pakistan. Thank you all so very much. These presentations are very informative for a person like me. And listening to the kind of checks and balances that have been built into these mechanisms of delivery of aid, I believe it gives us a lot of confidence in those mechanisms. And there are two observations which I would like to share with you. They are pertinent to these cases. Some of you might like to respond to those. First is, in most of the cases of aid projects, we see that communities' needs probably are not best represented in the in envisaging any aid projects. For example, in Afghanistan, a friend of mine was telling me that where we need a tube well, there's a school. Where we need a school, there's a tube well. So community participation in assessment of those needs is very important in my view. Second is, you talked about aid, and certainly aid is very important a vehicle to achieve objectives of like poverty reduction and so on and so forth. The list is endless. We have seen that in the current economic climate, aid is the first thing that gets slashed anywhere in the world. And there is hardly any country in the world which is able to keep that 1% GDP target, that have been able to realize that. There should have been, or rather there should be other vehicles or avenues that should also be explored equally well, like what Catherine alluded to of investment and trade. But there then we find the challenges like the WTO round of Doha. It's in deadlock for the last 20 years. There is no progress on that. And then you also see that countries like Indonesia just terminated, I believe, over 50 bilateral investment treaties. So there must be some problems in those areas. I think it is very important to identify such issues, such problems, and then address those by generating sort of public consensus within the country to reflect changes in the policy and the eventual outcome. Thank you very much.
Is it more a comment or there is any question also?
It's basically an observation come question.
Okay.
So I think it's a very good observation, and I agree with a lot of what you say. I think one of the challenges of delivering aid is really understanding the context in which you're delivering aid. And I think there have been a lot of mistakes made in aid delivery. Something works in one country, so let's get a consultant in, design a project, and use a cookie-cutter approach and see if it works in another. And the reality, it doesn't. And I think, the aid community more broadly has learned a lot of lessons in this space, and some very hard lessons in that space, and sometimes we still make the same mistakes regardless. But part of that is really understanding the context, and the context is key. And to understand the context, you actually have to do the analysis. And so one of the things that DFAT is trying to do more of is look at the political economy analysis, to look at gender analysis, to start really, before you actually embark on an investment, really understand the political context in which you're working, understand the civil society elements of that investment, and really start deconstructing the environment so that when you make an investment decision, there are so many different things you can do. You make the right one. And unfortunately, there's no magic formula yet. We haven't actually worked out what the perfect investment is in every case. But through monitoring and evaluation and doing assessments, we can at least learn from experience and try and change the approach so that we can actually get the results that we're trying to achieve. The other thing we try and look at is constraints for growth. Part of the things, part of the new aid paradigm is we need to get foreign direct investment into the countries we're supporting. We need to work with the government to really encourage the private sector and private sector growth in those countries. But what are the constraints? Is it regulatory? Is it the fact that they don't have open borders, that they're not trading effectively? How can we work with those partner governments to actually make the regulatory environment for foreign direct investment to occur? So they're all complex challenges, and the aid program isn't the only solution, but these are the things that we're beginning to look at more thoroughly.
Just got a brief observation again in terms of your comment about the community's needs and that being reflected in projects. And again, I don't have a solution, but it's a challenge for a number of reasons. And the Red Cross model, I guess, given one of our again, back to the principles, is volunteerism. Like the Red Cross movement has, I think, about 17 million volunteers worldwide. So if you look at it from the perspective of countries, say in Southeast Asia, when we're working in those communities, the volunteers are members of their own communities, and they're the ones who are involved in talking with their branches, the Red Cross branches, to design projects. The challenges we encounter, I guess, is when you go to a community and you ask, what sort of support do you need to, I guess the language we use, how can we support your resilience? Is that their challenges can be diverse. They could be something, they could be health. They could be, well, we're worried because we've got a new road coming through, lots of kids getting hit by the road, they don't know about how to use the cars. So it ends up being what falls into, I guess, different buckets of funding, because you can, in the sector, you can apply for health funding or you can apply for those sorts of funding. So it's also thinking about how we think, if you look at it from the community up, it's so diverse. It's similar to what Catherine was saying, it doesn't neatly fit into a bucket when we're using that as our lens in terms of how we're thinking about funding programs. So we can have a perfect program designed and a funder will only fund a little bit of it because they want to fund health, for example. So that's just an observation of a challenge.
Just a couple of thoughts. I think there's a lot to be said for trying to tap the expertise of people who've been schooled in social anthropology in areas like project design. Political scientists often end up in this area, but they tend naturally to think of the state as the natural partner in projects, whereas very often when things are going to work, one needs a fairly intimate understanding of the complexities of particular social formations. And if one doesn't have that, the danger is that you'll run into strife fairly quickly. And I think one other thing that militates against community priorities is the urge to have quick impact projects in place to capitalise on what might seem to be windows of opportunity to shift a state away from disaster towards development. And that is often at the expense of consultation with communities and understanding of complexity. And you get these white elephant projects that can be schools without teachers, or schools without school books, or schools without electricity, or things like that. And they end up being monuments to poor policy design. Just in the Afghan case, and I think it's an illuminating example, one of the reasons that corruption took off in Afghanistan after 2001 was that the Bonn Agreement of December that year provided for 28 departments in the Afghan government, which was essentially so that all the different groups that participated in the conference could get a prize at the end, a bit like a door prize. And James Dobbins, the American ambassador who was there, actually described in his memoirs how our ministry was split in two in order to have more prizes to go around. So of course they ended up with a complex bureaucratic environment with the ministries under the control of different political groups and a lot of overlap in functional responsibilities. So you had a finance ministry, an economics ministry, a commerce ministry, and a reconstruction ministry, all of which were required to put their signatures on the proposals before they could be approved to go ahead. So if you were a donor pushing an implementing agency on the ground to show immediate results, one of the things you should expect was that they would end up having to grease palms fairly early in the process in order to meet anything like a timetable for the delivery of assistance. People wondered why corruption took off in Afghanistan. These kind of problems are almost elementary when you think about them, but it's surprising how often people who want to see quick results blunder into these kind of environments and then are confronted with outcomes that no one in particular wanted.
Sam, would you like to add something?
Thank you. Well, I agree that it's a bit sad that whenever there's any pressure on budgets, the first thing that gets cut is the overseas aid program, and clearly Australia is no exception. Although it is interesting to note that Great Britain, for example, despite the budget pressures that it has maintained its own commitment to aid, I think around 1% of GDP.
0.7%.
Well, 0.7% is the target, but yeah, but I guess it just, so in other words, it's placed a value on using their aid program as I guess as a policy tool to try and address some of their national interests, which is to look at particularly, I guess, poverty in Africa and clearly and now the Middle East, where obviously they're now facing some of the pressures because governance and poverty are contributing to this, not to mention the civil unrest. But as mentioned before, when the Australian government cut its aid budget, there was almost no public outcry. It didn't get cut once, it got cut twice, and there was still no cry. So the problem with the Australian aid and the kind of work that we want to do for poverty reduction is that people kind of say, yes, we all want to do that, we all want to be altruistic in this work. But actually when it comes to committing sizable amounts from the Australian aid, at least from the taxpayers, that's not met. But when you ask these, I don't know if you saw the comic Charlie Pickering, he did an interview and he went around and asked the Australian people how much money they thought went into the Australian aid program, and most people got it completely wrong. Most people thought we were putting, every average Australian was putting like $20 or something. As it turns out, I mean, currently it's for every $100 spent by the Australian government, 22 cents goes to aid. So it's the lowest it's been for a long, long time. But all I'm saying is that trying to get public support, and we who work in the sector have to do better at telling the stories about what works in Australia, through aid, because we obviously don't do that well enough. So it's not just the Australian public who perhaps aren't supported, it's they think there's more going towards that good work, yet in fact there's not so much in the way of funding, and we're obviously not doing a good storytelling how good that work is.
We've got time for